Hi, everyone. It's a great honor and pleasure for me to have Lisa Anderson with us today. And I hope that we learn a lot about her amazing experience in life, but also her ideas on higher education in general, and maybe about your people in particular. So thanks again for joining us, Lisa. And I would like to start by asking you to tell us a little bit about your journey. You are one of the leading international higher education scholars, and you have gone through a lot. So please share with us.
Well, thank you very much. It's a delight to be with you, and a testament to the enthusiasm I have for the University of the People, but we can get to that. I started actually without any intent to think internationally at all. When I went off to college, I expected to be a civil rights lawyer. And I took a law course and it was so boring. I thought, well, that's not going to work. So then I took a course that no one would dare teach now called Politics and Culture and World Affairs. It was about everything. And for this, relatively naive American girl, as I was then, it was an eye-opener. Just there's a whole world out there that I didn't know anything about. And it was taught by a very, very imperious instructor who essentially signed topics and papers and so forth to her students. And she said I should write a paper about Egypt. Now, she could have said Peru and my life would have been completely different, but she said Egypt. And I did the paper and I ended up, it was a 5 or 10 page paper, which was a significant effort at that point, but I ended up writing about 60 pages about Egypt. I just kept writing and writing and writing. And I obviously fell for it. I fell for knowing something about a place, about being the family authority about Egypt, because of course that wasn't very hard, but nonetheless it felt empowering. And so several things happened out of that experience. Obviously, I came to be interested in the Middle East and North Africa, which turned out to be a scholarly direction that I went. But I also became convinced that the kind of impulse that had propelled me to want to be a civil rights lawyer, that is to say I want to change the world, actually, that's what education does. It does it at the retail level. It does one person at a time. But you change the world because you're changing what people can think they can do. So it was my own personal experience of having been changed by this experience that sort of propelled me through the rest of my career. So I went off, did my dissertation, actually, as it turned out, on Tunisia and Libya, because in part I thought that the scholarship on Egypt was so good that I couldn't contribute to it, so I'd rather do something. There were at the time 6 or 7 books on Libya in English, so I thought, well, if I wrote the next one, that would be a contribution, which as it turned out, it was. But I really just fell in love with learning and the experience of doing research and then doing that together with other people, which is what teaching is. So, I went off on an academic career, having considered other kinds of things, and ended up serving as the dean of the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia for a decade, a job I absolutely adored, and in part because it was such an international community, and in part because that kind of education, again, changes the life prospects of the people who have access to it. And then I was invited in 2008 to become the provost of the American University in Cairo, which was a staggering honor at the time. I had just stepped down as dean, thought I was going to be going back to teaching, and thought this was an opportunity I couldn't resist. 3 years later, at the beginning of 2011, I was invited to become the president, which I did, and I had 25 days of an ordinary presidency in Cairo before the events of 2011 took place. And so steered the university through what was then known as the revolution and is now known as one of the revolutions of that period. It was absolutely fascinating. I wouldn't have traded it for the world. It was extremely complicated, but it was a ringside seat at some of the most consequential events of the modern history of the region, at least. And I think we navigated those complicated waters well during that time of keeping the university open, keeping it, its students and faculty and everyone safe and engaged and thoughtful about what was going on around them. And so ultimately decided that 5 years in those circumstances is the equivalent of 10 anywhere else. And I was probably ready to turn it over to my successor. And so I came back to New York, and I'm again teaching at the School of International Public Affairs at Columbia, and again loving it.
Wait, that's amazing. But I have to go back to Cairo of 2011, because it's, as you said, it's like being in the middle. Actually, the history is happening, and you're in charge of the American University, which it's American, right? And there are all the. What did you learn about the region? I'm sure you can talk. I agree, you can talk hours about it, but about the region, and what did it do to the institution itself?
Well, I mean, we had very, very tangible things that we had to be concerned about. The American University in Cairo's principal campus is now outside the city, but its original campus, where it was for 90 years, which it still operates downtown, is on Tahrir Square. So we had to worry about the safety of the campus and the staff there and the security. And that it was just interacting, and between that campus is between Tahrir Square and the Ministry of the Interior, which was, of course, one of the targets of the protesters. So it was a very fraught time, and that, in very, as I say, tangible, sort of palpable ways. Moreover, we had many employees who were dependent on their monthly paycheck. As we got toward the end of January, all the banks were closed. The entire country had closed for a little while, as you may remember. The internet was down and so forth and so on. So we had lots and lots of custodial workers, security workers, landscape workers, all sorts of people who really depended on their monthly paycheck. And they were getting very worried. And we were worried not only about them as human beings, but also if they couldn't come to work for some reason, this was not good for us as an institution. Anyway, we did a lot of things like trying to figure out how we could get cash to pay them, and how we could, have them write us little receipts that they had gotten cash for their pay, and so forth and so on. So it was very interesting to see the life of Egyptians, of how people navigated under circumstances of duress, how they trusted each other, the circumstances in which they would ask for help and not ask for help, and so forth and so on. So we spent a lot of that 18 days really thinking about how to support the term we now use as human capital of the institution through a time which was, for many of them, quite exciting and invigorating and so forth, but for some of them was also terrifying, because they had families to worry about. They had, they were the breadwinners, and we had to think about those circumstances as well. But, through the subsequent years, as people began to think about politics for the first time, whatever you thought of Mubarak, he had been in office for 30 years, which was, the lifetime of many of the people that we had at the university. So it was very interesting to watch them become political, to think in political terms, to think about, what responsibility they might have for their own government, what kinds of policies they actually wanted that government to pursue. None of those things had ever been part of ordinary discourse. People just didn't talk about it because it was essentially above their pay grade, and it didn't change anyway. And suddenly they were being told it was their pay grade. They were supposed to be involved. And interestingly, some I think some people were reluctant to do that. They really didn't want to be. And, we, particularly, I am a political scientist. We political scientists and policy people and so forth tend to assume that everybody's interested in politics. Actually, not everybody is interested in politics. And I learned that a lot of people would just as soon, be the followers of their football team as the followers of their political party. So it was interesting to see people decide whether they cared about politics, and if they did, decide who they would support and why. And so it was fascinating.
Oops, sorry. I wonder, and I'm going back as as one of the top political scientists of the region, looking at the Arab Spring, Egypt, but all the other countries. Had you thought at the time that it might happen, and when it started, what was the thinking then? How would it evolve? Because it was.
Yeah.
No, just because.
First of all, none of us expected it. None of us expected it, and anyone who says they expected it is wrong. I remember being in actually, we had a guest speaker visiting from overseas, and so we were having a dinner at a hotel with about, 50 people at the, it was an event that we were sponsoring at the time on the 14th of January, and so a couple of our faculty were Tunisian, so we were following what was going on in Tunisia, and somebody got a tweet from someone else saying, Ben Ali had left the country. So we all, were sort of interested in that and the buzz in the room and so forth. To a person, everybody agreed, because we openly discussed it, it would never happen in Egypt. So clearly, there was no sense, there was a sense that people were unhappy and that there was discontent and that the preceding parliamentary elections had been rigged more than necessary, so forth. So there was a underlying discontent that was palpable. But that had been true for a while. There wasn't any reason to think that this would, evolve into 18 days of closing the country before the president stepped down. So I think no one expected it. I think there had been political science suggesting that this sort of authoritarianism in the region was not stable and was not sustainable. But that political science had gotten old as the regime seemed to be stable and sustainable. So at that point, I think people had sort of lost their nerve as analysts and sort of said, well, maybe there's something we don't understand. We just can't, account for the stability of these regimes. Well, then they all fell, or not all of them, but a lot of them fell. And the sense of stability in the region, I think, has been shattered permanently, which I think is a good thing. I think I think it's been shattered permanently not only for political scientists who now have to actually explain the circumstances in which authoritarian regimes can reassert themselves and restabilize or fall apart completely into civil war and so forth, But I also think, and this is the little hope coming out of the Pandora's box that these uprisings opened, I think it's also shattered in the region. I just don't think people believe any longer that politics is above their pay grade. So they may not necessarily be content with the regime they have. They may not feel that it's, worth the trouble to try and bring it down, particularly when they see what's happened in some of the countries where the regime has fallen and so forth. But I don't think there's a sense that this is, a different universe any longer. These are people who can opine about politics in a way that they had not done before. And that, I think, is a permanent change.
That is interesting observations. You look at the region, and no doubt that it's not the same region, even though, you look at Syria, you look at Tunisia, you look at Egypt, and it's like, every country took its own path, and it's Libya. So what role does the American University of Cairo play in the Arab higher education world? because it's American university within the Arab world. There are a few of them. Please, for those who don't know, but tell us what it is for those who don't know what it is.
Well, it's an American-style university accredited in the United States. The language of instruction is English. It's now just celebrated its 100th anniversary. It is not formally connected to the other institutions called American. So the American University in Beirut actually is older than the American University in Cairo, and I often think of them as sort of like Harvard and Yale. That is to say, they're in the same league, but they're competitors. So, and in fact, compete less for students than for faculty sometimes. And, so it's a congenial relationship. And there is now an American university in Sharjah with which AUC has had good relations, but similarly, a different history and a different sort of institutional arrangements. All of these institutions represent a certain kind of aspiration, that is to say, for high quality liberal arts education, which is otherwise almost completely absent in the Arab world. And there are good quality engineering faculties, for example. At Cairo University the engineering faculty is excellent. But it's not a liberal arts program. It's a European style, if you get into engineering, that's what you do. If you get into medicine, that's what you do. And you don't broaden out and try and take courses in other disciplines and so forth, which is the American model. So it is a reflection of the conviction of Americans that this is a good way to design post-secondary education. It is also, all of these schools have turned out to be, I think they weren't intended entirely this way, but I don't think the founders would be unhappy to hear me say that they have educated the elite of the region. And the American University in Cairo tends to be overwhelmingly Egyptian in its student body, partly because Egypt is a third of the Arab world by population. So they don't have to reach out beyond. So the American University in Beirut has historically educated the elite of Syria, in fact, historically educated the elite of Afghanistan, was much more regionally powerful. Because Lebanon is so small that obviously you recruit outside Lebanon. Egypt is so big that the American University in Cairo, although it has had, for example, Queen Rania of Jordan is an AUC alum. So there are non-Egyptians, but where AUC has had its biggest impact is in the Egyptian business and policy communities and so forth and so on, where it has in fact produced a staggering proportion of the very successful. And we think that's partly because, just for starters, being bilingual is a good thing. So these are people who are obviously proficient in Arabic and proficient in English. So we understand some of the practicalities of why we're so wonderful and influential. But I also do think that the expectation that students will be challenged and learn things that they hadn't learned at home and learn things that made them have to rethink and, consider what they really care about and so forth is part of the, sort of genius of this kind of education. And I think it has contributed to the sort of agility of our alumni in important ways. I like to think, honestly, that the School of International Public Affairs at Columbia does the same kind of thing, that, gives students not only an opportunity, but almost an obligation to think out of their boxes. And then they can go back into their boxes, but they're going to be more agile and more creative and more thoughtful over the course of their careers than they would have been otherwise. So it has spawned a number of not competitors, but Other institutions have emulated it. So in the Emirates, you now have in both Sharjah and Dubai, you have things called American University In, which are to some extent, in curricular terms, certainly Sharjah is a lot like AUC. American University in Dubai is a little bit more pre-professional. And in Egypt, there is the German University in Cairo and other kinds of institutions that have borrowed at least the sort of branding, if you will, but not necessarily the philosophy of the university.
Are they accepted by the regime?
I mean, Nasser sent one of his daughters to AUC.
Okay, that's an answer.
Mrs. Mubarak and both the Mubarak boys went to AUC. It's understood to be, if you will, nonpartisan. It's understood to be designed to benefit Egypt. We always said that. And through the whole revolution and all of the political upheavals and so forth and so on, we said, look, we're here to serve Egypt. That's the purpose of the institution. We happen to think that this kind of education does that. And we understand that if you want to go to, the Faculty of Engineering at Cairo University, you should do that. But we think that this kind of education is the best kind of education for the future of Egypt. So we were, candid about that, but we never said that we thought the future of Egypt belonged to a particular political party or to a particular ideology and so forth. And so even during the Morsi year, we had students whose parents were in Morsi's cabinet. We probably had less uptake on the Muslim Brotherhood side of the spectrum than in other parts of the Egyptian political spectrum, but we had many students whose family were associated with the Brotherhood during that time. And we never, that wasn't a criterion for admission, so we didn't really care. We wanted smart, ambitious students who were going to, do something worthwhile with themselves.
Jumping to UoPeople. So after all these amazing things, you decided to join University of the People President's Council. Why? So thank you for doing it. I think you're an amazing addition to the unit, to our President's Council, so thank you. But why?
Well, partly because you're such a good salesperson, Shai. but more seriously, that is true. Honestly, I came to University of the People when I heard about it years ago, actually, a little skeptical, as I think probably many people were in higher education in the United States, particularly. Distance learning was a new idea. It wasn't obvious that the quality was going to be as good as, the brick and mortar and so forth and so on. And I remember the enthusiasm of people that obviously you know very well, David Cohen and Roxy Smith and some of your early recruits. And they would talk about it and I would think, maybe. But honestly, I was a little skeptical. And I think one of the things that's been wonderful for me about this association is how it has permitted me once again to learn and rethink how I anticipate the future to look and what kinds of skills people are going to need and what kind of mechanisms are going to permit us to broaden that out. So obviously from the very beginning, as I started in the United States and then went out into the rest of the world, one of the things that I've cared about is, and one of the things I deeply believe is that education is transformative, and it is for individuals and it is for societies. So that shouldn't be limited to the people who can get to a brick and mortar institution and can spend that kind of time and often that kind of money. So what are the ways that this can be broadened out? What are the ways that this potentially transformative experience can be made accessible to people? And I think that that's what the University of the People is doing, actually. And I think it's doing it, again, we don't have the alumni yet to be able to say, oh, 25 years ago, this course made me think of a different track for my life, the way I can talk about my own experience. But I actually think that that's the kind of thing that's going to happen, that people are going to see opportunities, are going to see skills they didn't know they could acquire, career opportunities that they didn't think they had, that they hadn't even thought about. Honestly, I had never thought about higher education as a career. And until I was exposed to people in higher education. Here I am. So that's why I'm interested in it. At some point, I want us to, not only extend this around the world in millions of languages and so forth, but I also hope that we start teaching, philosophy and things like that. But right now, because I think that can be transformative too. But I actually think you need to bring education to where people are physically and socially, or and it's very hard when you are just struggled your way through a secondary school. You may be very smart, but it was hard to be there and so forth and so on, to think about what you would benefit. So you say, you benefit from these skills, and then you start them on that journey that way.
I can't agree more with you, obviously, but but I want to take, we have now 65,000 students. 10,000 of them are coming from the Arab world. 3,500 of them are studying in Arabic. We expect it to grow dramatically. But out of this, well, not necessarily, but we also have 6,000 refugees. Many of them are Syrian and other Arab-speaking students. What do you see the role of UoPeople in the Arab world?
Well, look, I did suggest, and I do believe, that there's some pretty good faculties, like Faculty of Engineering at Cairo University and so forth and so on. But by and large, the consensus, even among the higher education community in the region, is that higher education in the Arab world is terrible. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that you have the time and capacity to get to a good national university in anywhere, in Syria, in Iraq, or in Egypt. You can get to them, and you can spend 4 years, and so forth and so on. You're still going to be in a class with 1,000 people. It's not as if you have the sort of one-on-one experience that transformed my life. And so the facilities aren't very good, and the faculty aren't paid well, and they're not provided support. And so everybody knows this. So this is not a secret in the region. But it does mean that people are discouraged from prospective students are discouraged from taking what they're doing very seriously. Either it's not worth the trouble because they never see an instructor anyway. All they do is read the books and take a test. So why are they assuming that, So the nice thing about what UoPeople is doing is to say, this experience is not less. You actually have more interaction with instructors and other students than you would have if you were a full-time student at some of these national universities, which is a sorry story. And, one wishes that weren't the case. But it is the case, and it's going to be the case for the foreseeable future for most of this huge number of young people in the region. So it's a way of kind of diversifying the options for students with, who are interested in, business or, the kinds of things that most students see as the way out of unemployment. Most of the people who go through these degree programs in national universities end up unemployed anyway. So clearly it doesn't see. So what's interesting about the Arab world as a place to if you will, experiment with this is some of the things that one often says about distance learning are actually less true in the pedagogy of University of the People than they are in the big national universities. I mean, Cairo University has 250,000 students. You don't get much attention. Whereas if you're in a class of University of the People, you get some attention. You get feedback, you get the interactions and so forth. So it sort of turns the experience, or what it means, what the prospects for students are, on their heads. Suddenly you have an opportunity to actually learn in what people believe is a better environment for learning, relatively small, relatively interactive, even though it's not in person. So it does upend a lot of the sort of cliches about what education means. And this is a part of the world which is absolutely right for that, which is why you've seen such quick, enthusiastic uptake since you've rolled this out.
Well, what I take from what you're saying is not only that we're giving amazing opportunity to those who study with us, let's hope that we'll make some change in higher education in the region. I can't be happier than if we feel that we were part of those who created some change. So we are getting close to the end of this amazing session. So my final question for you is, from your experience, what advice would you give our students?
Well, within the Arab world, I think I've essentially said already that I think this is an opportunity to get a kind of education and to take advantage of exposure to people that you wouldn't otherwise get. And so you should do that. And at the end of the day, as we know, many students will go on to face-to-face educational opportunities in other places and so forth. I think that's certainly one thing everybody should consider. I think I see much of what the University of the People is doing is opening doors and windows to the rest of the world, to opportunities beyond where anyone is at a given moment. That's education to me. So I would recommend that they look through all those windows and walk through all those doors and see where this is going to take them. It is a set of opportunities that I think for most of the students who are enrolled in University of the People programs, this is one of the few of those windows and doors. And so all you want is for people to take advantage of it, walk through, go to the next stage. And you will find it as you are, making that journey. I think you will find it actually transformative, which is what we all hope for.
That is fascinating. Thank you so much. I enjoyed it so much. I'm going to listen to it again because Thanks again. And
sure thing.
Thanks for everything you're doing for us and for the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Shai. My pleasure.
Thanks.